Hello, welcome to IRM's presentation of where do your cyber vulnerabilities exist. Today's agenda is why, despite endless penetration tests, do the bad guys still win? Where do your cyber vulnerabilities exist? Your organization, a hacker's perspective, tried and tested stories from the front line, and security testing, where should you be? So what we have here is the threat spectrum detailing the complexity and impact of different types of attackers. We can see this goes all the way from script kiddie, which is your stereotypical hacker in their mum's basement, typing away, trying to attack any website, not really fussed about what they're doing, will either take a website offline or, for all they know, get a full database dump of employee or user credentials and credit card details, right up to nation-state attackers. And these are the much more targeted, the much more technically competent. These are the guys who are creating the next Stuxnet and really on the cutting edge. And then you've got everything in between, which is where pen testing tends to take place. Why, despite endless pen tests, do the bad guys still win? This is an interesting question. Why in 2016, when we all know about the importance of security and penetration testing, and we all are keen to get our systems secured before they go live, are we still falling over and getting beaten by the bad guys? This is to do with the fundamental way pen testing takes place. When you look at an organization, there is a large attack surface that is available. However, when we look at penetration testing, it's a very pinpoint, precise activity. What happens is a penetration tester is given a specific scope of attack, and they are to assure a client that everything within that scope is secure and identify any issues that are within that area. What happens though is that we see companies that have removed things from scope that are potential vulnerabilities, that maybe their legacy equipment and there's decommission plans for them, however they still exist, but project managers don't want them tested because they know they're bad. Or we see clients that just don't think that there could be a link between one or two different areas of a company. But this means that penetration testers don't spend their time attacking the systems that would be most interesting to an attacker. Instead, they're trying to get full coverage of different areas in a scope without the ability to explore beyond that. Your organization, a hacker's perspective. So what we see when we look at organizations is that there are many ways an attack could take place. There could be advanced persistent threat code on the system, there could be malware going across the network, wireless attacks may be something that the company is vulnerable to. The external infrastructure could be exposing a company to a large attack surface on the internet, and intellectual property of a client may be at risk due to a lack of security. When we're conducting penetration tests, as said before, we're looking at these very individually. We're determining whether or not advanced persistent threat is on the network, whether or not there's malware that's spread across. If the wireless network is secure, then fantastic. We do not turn around in a penetration test and make the link between these silos, and that's the problem at the moment. The approach is a very siloed approach, and it means that you don't get a full coverage and you don't get to see a real picture. Whereas when an attacker does this, they're going to see all of these as one and the same, all different attack points for one victim. We've got to remember, hackers don't stick to a scope. They don't have a script. They don't follow a playbook. They will go from attack vector to attack vector and bounce around until they get where they want to be. Tried and tested stories from the front line. So some basic examples of what we're trying to get across here is that open source investigation. Open source investigation can provide a lot of information about employees, about companies, and give you a much better idea of what kinds of attacks are likely to be successful. So what we mean here is that when conducting open source investigation, you're going to have a look at who your high profile targets are within the company and identify employees that might be useful to attack. You're going to be trying to find information about the external footprint of a client, without them knowing. You're going to be trying to find out all the systems that are accessible via the internet that they might not be aware about. This leads nicely into the fact that we've previously been able to pull down 5 to 10 gigs worth of financial data without having to compromise the machine at all, just by identifying a web server that was unknown to a client, that through simple techniques we were able to get access to 5 to 10 gig of client financial information. And this is a serious problem, and this highlights that with your open source investigation and your minimal attacking, you can get access to a lot of details. Social engineering is something that is a big deal in this day and age. We've got a lot of technical ways to defend ourselves, but humans are always the weakest aspect. And in 2016, it is still possible to approach an employee, tell them you're from IT, and that you just need them to write down your password, you just need them to write down their password, and leave you with their device. This is equally possible to do over the phone. You can phone people up and tell them that you just need them to provide you remote access, and people still do it in 2016. They're still providing this level of access and this level of trust. Phishing comes into play here a lot. Phishing is one of your main attack vectors for social engineering. You're going to use your open source investigation results. You're going to know what kind of ethos a victim has, and you're going to use that to tailor your phishing attack that gets sent to an entire company. Or you're going to have identified a few high-profile targets and found out a lot more about them, and send something much more personal and very much a spear phishing campaign to just a few people who are of interest to you. Physical systems, we find that there are still 2003 machines that are on the internet. There are still networks that are supporting Windows XP legacy devices. This is something where it's really difficult to try and get rid of all these legacy devices, but if they're just exposed to the network the same as all your Windows 7, Windows 2016 servers, and there's no special protection against these much more vulnerable systems, then they're going to be the cause of your network being compromised. It's most likely that they will be the foot in the door that leads to an attacker moving through your network. How much data do you leak? So this goes back to the open source investigation, and it's really highlighting how much information someone can gain about you without ever really coming into contact. On a personal level, this works well to use things like Facebook and Twitter to get an idea about your target if you've picked someone of interest, whether you've picked a board member or a head of IT or a head of department at all. You can get an idea of likes, dislikes, family members, try and get some of those default password reset questions such as city of birth. You can try and get access to all of these on social media. You can then use things like LinkedIn to get an idea of professional history, determine whether or not a target's likely to click on a link from a recruiter if they move around often, or whether or not they've got a certain background with different types of technology. If they're in the IT department, this might be of particular interest. Not only that, but you're going to see whether or not someone's done any of the legwork for you. You're going to have a look at places like Pastebin or Have I Been Pwned to see whether or not any big breaches or any leaks can give you, straight off the bat, usernames, passwords, can give you an idea on technical issues. Pastebin may give you a good resource of identifying what websites are specifically vulnerable against different things people have found, if someone's running old versions of software. And this is just all the information that is out there because of the mere nature of the fact that we're all on the internet in this day and age. Know your target. So this again comes down to making sure that you as the attacker are going to know your target. You're going to have a look at the company profile, you're going to have a look at the company website, and you're going to try and follow them across the internet. You're going to try and know them to the point that you have a much higher success rate when it comes to the attacks you launch. Should you be able to find any resources on the internet such as technology forums that employees of your target have used to discuss the pros and cons of different systems, or your IT forums where people are asking for advice about how to lock down certain technologies, this is all information that can go into a dossier of knowing how you're going to attack someone and what's likely to work. And it's important to remember that this is not an IT activity. What you've got to think is reception at your front desk. They are a risk. They're a guard to an entry point for a physical building. So they need to be aware of whether or not someone should be allowed in or should not, and what the process is. Vishing and phishing are two attacks that you may fall victim to. We've all heard of phishing, the email attack, where we receive an email that's enticing us to download a link or run a file or just commit some kind of action that we may not be supposed to be doing. Vishing, on the other hand, is doing essentially the same attack but over the phone. This is where you've got a direct communication with a target and you're talking to them on the phone, really trying to entice them to just give you remote access to their machine or just give you the details that you might want. It could be a password, it could be an address, it could be anything, but both of these really rely on human weakness to get the information an attacker wants. And when it comes to these things happening over the phone, it can be very hard for people to say no because it's almost a form of conflict that they're not happy to have. Employee awareness. So while this is in part to do with the social engineering we've just discussed, it's also important to make sure that not only do users not click malicious links, but they don't go to unknown websites that may have been deployed via a leaflet drop. They don't plug unknown devices into laptops such as USB sticks or mobile phones or SD cards. These are all ways that an attacker can attempt to use human curiosity to get onto a system. And providing something like a link to a malicious site or potentially a legitimate site that's already been hacked means that you've got your way in, and that's been allowed and facilitated by an employee who's done that work for you. Security testing, where you should be. So what we can see is that traditional penetration testing really covers the lower levels of complexity. This is down to trying to get full coverage of systems in a limited time frame, and it means that what a typical penetration test is trying to do is really identify the low-hanging fruit, the big issues, and find the easy wins so that we can fix them and we can make everything that little bit more secure. However, it's going to be constrained to sort of like that pinpoint precision testing. When we get into scenario-based testing, that means that we're engaging that much more complex type of assessment. And it means that we get a much better idea of whether or not we truly are vulnerable or not. This is the type of test where there's more freedom to move from one system to another. There's a bit more link between how things work, and everything isn't as siloed from you're testing a website or the wireless network or this piece of infrastructure. And this is much better testing because it provides a much more realistic view on how attacks are going to happen to you. And then we get up to this nation-state type of attack where realistically you're going to be having someone spend a lot of time researching the technology you're using and actively developing the new exploits that are going to be coming out day in, day out. A lot of people have time for this, and it means that what we find is that when someone can sit down and spend enough time, everything eventually breaks, and there are constantly new vulnerabilities and new exploits identified and created by this very method. But when we get to this kind of level of testing, when we avoid this penetration testing way of doing things, so what we get is a much more realistic approach to an attack. The supply chain is in scope. The network is a target. The people are an attack vector. We can utilize multiple different skill sets and we can attack a lot of different systems through a lot of different methods. And this means that we can truly identify where the vulnerability lies and what needs to be improved. Be that network security, third-party providers, employee education. This is going to be the type of test that allows you to have a better understanding of your vulnerability because it's a much more realistic test. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Dan Cannon. If you do want any more information, feel free to visit irmsecurity.com or click any of the links below to get further information. Thanks very much.